Hi, good morning. Can you hear me? Or I can't. I'm not hearing you. I'm afraid. Sorry. Okay. I need to just a moment. I need to check my audio. Can I just check the audio? I couldn't hear you before. I'm sorry.
Can you hear me, sir, now?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Let me just test PowerPoint.
Yeah, please, sir, please.
You need to give me screen sharing.
Yeah. The School of Oriental and African Studies. Sir, please have a try.
Okay, so can you see the PowerPoint screen?
Yeah. It's very much visible.
All right. Okay, looks like everything's working.
Yeah.
I should tell you that the talk will be just the same as what I tried to present on Monday.
Yeah.
So I hope it's not boring for people who already came.
Not at all.
Okay. And is my audio all right?
Yeah. It's
Okay.
very audible and clear. Quite clear.
Okay. Hi, Kavita. No, Vineza. Yeah, very good. Thank you. You can turn this sharing off if you like.
Sir, college ಇದೆ ಹಾಕಿದ್ವಲ್ಲ ಹಂಗೆ. ಕೊಡಿ. ಅಲ್ಲ ನಿಮಗೆ ಇದು ಬಂದಿಲ್ವಾ ಲಿಂಕ್? ಜಾಯಿನ್ ಮೀಟಿಂಗ್ ಅಂತ ಇದೆ. ಹ್ಮ್. ಅಲ್ಲಿ Hello everyone and welcome to today's session. This is our second international web talk series on contemporary issues hosted by the Department of Linguistics and PG Studies in English. This series, in fact, Professor Austin delivered lecture on 14th of this month on language endangerment. What is it and what can we do about it? In fact, due to Google outage, this talk was interrupted halfway through and is being rescheduled today. So I welcome back Professor Shivamogga, and also I welcome all the dignitaries and participants, those who have taken part in this. And I request my colleague and senior faculty member, Department of PG Studies in English, and the coordinator to welcome the guest speakers and all the participants. And then give a brief introduction for Peter Austin and go on lecture, and it is followed by discussion and the final honorable register. This is the agenda. So may I now request you welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Mehdi. Thank you, Dr. Mehdi. Good afternoon to all. And good morning, Professor Peter again, sir. I hope some introduction completed. But we are fortunate enough to listen your talks once again. First of all, I would like to welcome all the dignitaries on this occasion. Professor Peter K. Austin, SAS University, the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, Sir Professor Emirate Professor. Sir, I extend warm welcome to you once again. I hope everything will be all right this time. Welcome you, sir. Also, I welcome our Chief Patron, Professor B.V. Veerabhadrappa, Honorable Vice Chancellor of Kuvempu University. I welcome you, sir. I welcome Professor S.S. Patil, Honorable Registrar, Kuvempu University. Also, I welcome Chair and Principal, Dr. K.B. Dhananjay, Sahyadri Arts College. I would like to welcome our organizing secretaries, Dr. Methi Mallikarjun, Department of Linguistics, Dr. T. Avinash, Department of PG Studies in English. And last but not least, the very important, all the participants. I would like to appreciate your enthusiasm. Again, you have joined our web talk series. Once again, I welcome all the participants of India as well as overseas. I welcome you all. Thank you, one and all. Over to Mehdi.
Thank you, madam. Thank you very much. So now I make a very brief introduction to today's resource person, guest speaker, Professor Peter. So Professor Peter Austin is Emeritus Professor in field of linguistics at a School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. He retired on 31st December 2018 after having worked at School of Oriental and African Studies for 15 years. His research covers descriptive, theoretical, and applied linguistics with a focus on the theory and practice of language documentation and revitalization. He has carried out fieldwork on Australian Aboriginal languages, especially in New South Wales, South Australia, and Western Australia, and the Australasian languages, Sasak and Saban, spoken on Lombok and Sumbawa Island in eastern Indonesia. He has been involved in language revitalization work with the Jairi Aboriginal Corporation of South Australia and the Bayonga Aboriginal Corporation in Western Australia. He's an active blogger, so one can visit his blog www.peterkaustin.com, and you can also look at his publishing house, that is EP Publishing, including its journal, language documentation, and description. So we are very grateful to Professor Austin because other day, due to Google outage across the globe, so we need to reschedule this thing. But he was very nice to accept our invitation again, and he is very kind enough to accept our invitation. So we welcome back Professor Peter Austin, and we request him to deliver his talk. Thank you, sir. Over to Professor Austin.
Okay, thank you, Meti, for that very kind introduction. And I hope that we don't have a similar experience to what
Not
happened.
audible.
Hello?
Hello.
Can you hear me okay?
No.
Yeah, but we can hear you, but it's very volume low. Volume low.
I think now it's clear.
Yeah.
Now it's clear.
Okay. Yeah, please.
Could you please remind everyone?
Yeah. Now it's very much audible.
Please remind everyone to turn off their, to mute their microphones, because I'm hearing noises from, there are some people who have their microphones on. If they could turn them off, please. Okay, so are we ready?
Yeah, please, sir.
Okay. So thank you very much for your kind invitation to try again for the seminar, and also thank you to Professor Meti Milikarjun for her very kind introduction again. And I'm glad that we have a chance to speak, and I will try and talk for about 50 minutes and then open the floor to discussion. So if you have questions or comments, you can put them in the chat and we'll try and respond to them towards the end. If anyone was here on Monday, I apologize that I'm going to give the same talk. So at least for the first 40 minutes or so, what you hear will be the same thing, but hopefully you can bear with that, and I will try to leave time at the end for discussion. So let's share the screen. Very good. So what I'm going to talk about today is the notion of language endangerment and what it is and what we might be able to think about it or to do about it. The slides for today's talk are already available on my website, and it's as Meti mentioned, it's peterkaustin.com. If you look under talks, you will find the slides there, plus many other presentations that I've given over the last 5 years. So these are shared with you under Creative Commons license. You can use them for educational purposes and freely download them. And I want to thank some colleagues for discussions and ideas sharing, particularly Lise Dobrin, Lenore Grenoble, David Nathan, and Julia Salabank. But if there are any errors or mistakes or problems with what I say, those are mine. They are not due to my colleagues. So the overview for today's talk is I will talk briefly about global and local linguistic diversity, looking globally around the world, and then zooming in on the situation in India. Move on to a discussion of types of language situations. And here I want to emphasize, I'm going to suggest that we don't think in terms of endangered languages as such, but rather endangered language situations or language contexts. So my focus will be on contexts of language use, less on individual languages. Some of the responses that we see to these range of situations around the world, and what kinds of actions might be undertaken as part of the response. And then at the end, I'll try and draw some conclusions and suggest some possible directions. So let's start by looking at linguistic diversity as it applies around the world, and then also in India, and very briefly, what is happening in Karnataka. Now, I'm not a specialist in Indian or Dravidian languages, and so what I will give you is just a very superficial overview. There are other people who are much more knowledgeable and specialized in these topics. And I'll mention some of them as we go along. If we look at the situation globally in the world, we could ask how many languages are actually spoken today. And this is actually a very difficult question to answer because as many people have discussed, it's very difficult to distinguish languages from dialects. So we find there are many, many different ways of speaking, and some people would recognize some of these as grouped together as dialects and some as languages which have dialects within them, but there's no hard and fast way to draw divisions. So the notion of counting languages becomes very complicated because of diversity. And indeed, in some regions of the world, the data that we have is very unreliable. And this is particularly the case in South Asia. So if we look at India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sikkim, Bhutan, the language situations there in terms of speaker numbers, language numbers is really quite poor in terms of the data that's available on them. Now for India, I would recommend, if you're interested in looking at this in more detail, there are some talks by Professor Amvita Abhi and Professor Mishra, which are available through the Society for Endangered and Lesser Known Languages. They have a sequence of talks from earlier this year, which are available for you to look at on YouTube. So if you go to SEL, you will be able to access those. And Professor Abhi and Professor Mishra are specialists on the language situations in South Asia. At a sort of more general level, there's an international survey run by the organization called Ethnologue. And what that shows in the most recent edition, which is accessible online, you can see that they list 7,097 languages. It's a fairly precise number. As I suggested earlier, these numbers are very difficult to be sure about. So when I give you numbers and I talk about population numbers or numbers of languages, remember that this is rather vague and not in any way exact. So we can say roughly there are 7,000 languages spoken on Earth today, but the populations of those languages vary widely, from some which have over 1 billion speakers to some which are currently only known to a single individual. So there are quite a lot of languages in Australia, Aboriginal languages in Australia, where only one person can speak them now. So if we look at these 7,000, we saw the distribution is very uneven. Well, what are the top 10, the top biggest languages in the world? And here, again, I as a warning, these numbers are approximate, and what's relevant here is the trends, not the exact numbers or the precise identity. And when we look at these, we also need to distinguish between language use as a mother tongue being learnt in the home or in the community, as against language use in a wider sense as a means of communication between different groups. So the top languages you might have guessed is Mandarin Chinese, which has about 1 billion people using it as a language of wider communication, primarily in China or diaspora communities of Chinese people in different places. This is followed by number 2, Hindi Urdu, mostly in India and Pakistan, obviously also reaching into neighboring areas. 500 million speakers as a language of wider communication. And then English comes after this. It differs from Mandarin and Hindi Urdu in that it is a global language. It's used not only in different countries, but also really all around the world as a language of wider communication. Next, we find Spanish, which is used in many different countries, particularly in Central and South America. Arabic, which is also a multinational language, extremely diverse, however. So it doesn't, I mean, Spanish also has variation, and so do Hindi and Urdu, but Arabic is extremely diverse internally. Next comes another South Asian language, and here we have Bengali, spoken in India and Bangladesh. So you can see India already has 2 of the very largest languages. Then we have Portuguese, Russian, which is still quite an important language as a wider communication in the former Soviet areas in the now defunct Soviet Union. So throughout Central Asia, in places like Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan and so on, Russian as a language of education and wider communication is still very important. Japanese only pretty much restricted to Japan and smaller Japanese communities. And finally, number 10 is German, which is used in quite a number of different countries, Switzerland, Germany, Austria, but also fairly widely in Europe, with growing usage in the eastern part of the European Union. So those are the top 10 languages, and you can see from them that they have very large numbers, you know, 1 billion, 500 million speakers. And in fact, the top 10 languages listed there consist of about 40% of the world's population in total. So what do we see then is that we said there were 7,000 languages all around the world, but only 10 of them already have 40% of the speakers. And if we extend to the top 20 languages, we end up with more than 50% of the world's population. So the distributions here are very, very odd. A small number of extremely large languages, and then a large number of very small languages. In fact, the majority of the world's languages, 96% of them, are only spoken by 4% of the world's population. And among those smaller, thousands of smaller languages, half of them have less than 10,000 speakers, and 25% have less than 1,000 speakers. So in other words, global diversity is concentrated in thousands of very small groups and small numbers of speakers. The continent with the most languages around the world, roughly, again, these are not exact, they're sort of approximations, is Asia, followed by Africa. So what we find is about a third of the world's languages are spoken in Asia and another third in Africa. So 2/3 of the world's diversity is restricted to Asia and Africa. And you can see Europe is tiny. Languages like French and English and German and Spanish is spoken in Europe, a mere 4% of the world. So here's the figures that come out of the 2013 Ethnologue. Again, as I said, the exact numbers here are not truly relevant. It's the relativities of the percentages, which we can display in another way. You can see here's Asia and Africa, very, very much exceeding the diversity in other areas. Now, in addition to counting and trying to sort of quantify individual languages, we can also look at language diversity from the point of view of language families or groupings. And here we see a rather different picture, which is that the greatest diversity in terms of language families or groups is to be found in North and South America. So in South America alone, there are up to 100 different groups, genetically different groups. Now here, what I mean by groupings here is the difference between, let's say, Indo-Aryan, to which say Hindi belongs, Indo-European languages, as against Dravidian languages or Sino-Tibetan. So that's the extent of diversity in South America. So you can see it's way ahead of elsewhere. And although we notice that Asia has a large number of languages, they're actually not very diverse from a genetic or relationship perspective. Zooming into India, as I mentioned earlier, this is extremely complicated and difficult, mainly because the census data from India is really hard to make much sense of. The Indian census collects from people the name of what they call their language or their mother tongue, and then the Census Bureau kind of groups these together in some way. So there are hundreds of names that are collected, say, from northern India, which are all grouped together as being Hindi, even though they are very, very diverse. So the census recognizes 1,369 mother tongues, that is groupings of all these names spoken by 10,000 people or more. And then these are further broken down into 121 languages. So this figure here is very, very unreliable in terms of knowing whether we're dealing with languages, dialects, varieties, social things. And also notice that the counting stops at 10,000. So any mother tongues that are smaller than that really don't get classified within the census. And there are 22 of the 121 that are listed in the 8th schedule of the Constitution. 78% of people in India speak an Indo-Aryan language like Hindi or Urdu, and 20% speak a Dravidian language like Kannada, Malayalam, Telugu, Tamil, and quite a number of other smaller Dravidian languages. What that means is that the diversity we see with Austro-Asiatic family, Sino-Tibetan, Thai, Kadai, and the Andaman languages is only 2%. So relatively very, very small. And this is the kind of picture. So Indo-Aryan in the north here, dominant, Dravidian tending to be in the south, although there's languages like Brahui up here, which are Dravidian. And then the Andaman languages, which really are not very well understood or well classified. for Karnataka, the largest and dominant language, of course, is Kannada, with English being economically and politically important, and Hindi having a role in relation to interactions with the central government. And you know, there's been quite a bit of discussion, not to say dispute, about the role of Hindi in Karnataka and other areas of southern India. The smaller languages in Karnataka include Urdu, Konkani, which is Indo-Aryan, Marathi, Indo-Aryan, and Tulu, which is a small Dravidian language. Tamil, Telugu, Malayalam, Kodava is also Dravidian, Bihari, and there are some villages where and Sanskrit is actually. I hear somebody speaking in the background. If you wouldn't mind turning your microphone off, I'd appreciate that. Okay, now that gives us a kind of perspective.
Hello.
I'm sorry, somebody called Avinash, your microphone is on, and it's really quite disturbing. Thank you. So if we look at, so that was sort of looking at diversity, but actually we need to focus in on contemporary usages in different language groupings. Languages don't exist in isolation. They are found in together in serving different social functions. And there are a number of parameters we can use for exploring these relationships. The first of these is, has the big name intergenerational language transmission. What we mean here is, are children growing up and learning these languages in the home or in the local community from caregivers and from peers, from other children? The second factor is the percentage of speakers within a given population. So the absolute numbers, those big numbers we were talking about, or very tiny numbers for many languages, they're not so relevant as the percentage of speakers within a given ethnic group or ethnic community, because as we'll see in a few moments, those percentages can be relatively small. So you may have many people who identify as belonging to a certain group, but they don't speak the language of that group. The third parameter is domains and functions within which different languages are used. And the fourth are attitudes and ideology of the wider community within which minority languages are spoken. So is that language recognized? Does the wider community assign status to it? Does it have any kind of perception as being a useful language or a language that has some status? On the other side, we have speakers' attitudes towards their own languages, and these can vary from pride and strong support and very positive attitudes to, in some communities, negative attitudes associated with shame, a desire to not be picked out and separated and discriminated against because of the way they speak. So these are the five very helpful parameters that are in use. Now, I should mention there are other approaches which have many more parameters, and there's a thing called the EGIDS, which is a scale or a counting attempt to quantify, which is has to do with intergenerational transmission, and UNESCO has also promoted other factors. I'll come back to why I don't particularly like UNESCO and EGIDS and GIDS later, but let me emphasize now, I think these are the five major kind of relevant social and linguistic and political factors that we need to take into account. Now, if we do this, this gives us a topology of language situations. And here, let me re-emphasize, we're not talking about languages here, we're talking about situations or contexts within which one or more languages are spoken. And the general pattern around the world is that languages don't exist in isolation. There's always, in a given context, 2, 3, 4, 10 different languages that are in use. So a context, we can find contexts in which looking at the parameters I mentioned before, we have viable, safe, strong, vital language context. So a given language or way of speaking is used by all age groups, learned by children in the home or in the community, and actively supported both by the speakers themselves with positive attitudes and also possibly given recognition more broadly. Now, the total number of speakers here may be very small. So they may be in some of the Pacific nations, for example, we may be dealing with 1,000 people, but the language is still strong and viable because everybody's using it, children are growing up, and it has a recognition. The second category is endangered languages situations, and here we're talking about unequal distribution of social, economic, and political power, certain languages being associated with disadvantage, and speakers under heavy pressure from speakers of larger languages to not to speak their heritage tongue anymore, but for that to be replaced by something else. So we find in such contexts that some languages have reducing populations, and without changes in community attitudes and support and recognition, they will go out of use. The third are moribund language contexts, and here where languages are no longer learnt by children, they have a few older speakers and very little social function. And this is quite typical in, say, Aboriginal Australia, where we find hundreds of languages that are now moribund. And the final sort of context is where languages are extinct. They have no native speakers, nobody is learning them. Some people might remember some words or expressions or a few ways of talking, but the languages are not actively used in any way. Now, it's important to emphasize here that these are points on a continuum. So the 4 different points that I've identified here are really part of a continuum, so that languages situations can be more or less safe or more or less endangered. And the second thing I want to emphasize is that there's quite a lot of literature on language endangerment. Even if you just go and have a look at Wikipedia, for example, or other academic publications, some of which you can download freely, much of this literature has 3 very large problems. And these are problems that I and other colleagues have been trying to point out for the last 10 years or so. The first of these is objectification. That is treating languages, which are dynamic interactional means of communication, treating languages as if they were objects or things, and doing so in order to quantify them and count them and treat them as entities or objects. And languages are not. Languages exist in human interactional contexts, and they are dynamic and changing. The second big problem I see in the literature is essentialism. That is, treating characteristics of language situation as being absolutely necessary and fixed. And what we need to focus on is fluidity, variation, and change, and not to say, you know, it's absolutely the case this language is extinct because of factor X, Y, Z. The third important issue is what we could call absolutism. As you will have gathered from my repeating it so many times already, situations are not homogeneous. They are fluid and flexible, and there's a contingency relationship between language use and other aspects of social, political, economic, and human existence. So please be aware when you're reading about this topic that people tend to objectify, essentialize, and treat as absolute. Now, some languages have become extinct because of war, disease, genocide, loss of population. The languages of the Andaman Islands, for example, fall into this category. So Greater Andaman has really been disrupted and destroyed by the colonialist policies of the British and by the Indian government. But the vast majority of cases of language reduction, language context reduction, come out of not of those genocide or population loss, but rather the population remains or grows, but there is a shift in speaker numbers, and the speakers who remain are moving towards more dominant languages with more economic, social, political, and human power, or perceived as having that anyway. So we find across the world increasing age profiles, children not being participating in language use, and really only older speakers. And the result was that many linguists, including Michael Krauss, have argued that this will be a catastrophic situation where thousands of languages will disappear in the 21st century. And Krauss argued that 90% loss of diversity. Less extreme estimates seem to be much more commonly used now, so 50%. So we're talking about 3,500 languages disappearing during this century. In fact, the Endangered Languages Project based in Hawaii estimates that one language is lost somewhere around the world every roughly 2.5 months. You'll see some other figures quoted in the literature, but this is based on very close analysis. So approximately then we're losing 5 or 6 languages a year, and you can see the numbers will accelerate as time goes on. So there's a worldwide pattern of language situations moving from safe to endangered to moribund and extinct. And there's historical evidence this has been going on for quite some time, as languages on the Italian peninsula, like Etruscan and so on, were replaced by Latin during written history. But this has really speeded up in the last 200 years, and particularly since the Second World War, about 70 years ago, which through the spread of colonialism and post-colonial rise of hegemonic nation states with their own monolingual ideologies, one community, one people, one language, that sort of political notion has really pushed and speeded up the processes of language shift and loss. Combined more recently with massive migration, urbanization, and globalization. So many village community members moving into urban centers looking for work and economic support. So should we care about this? Is this something we should be worried about? Well, the answer that many people give, people in the general population, is that no, this is not a problem. This is great. The fewer languages there are, the better. If we all spoke the same language, we would be able to understand each other, and this would result in peace and prosperity. It would be economically rational. Instead of having to have all these teaching materials in dozens of languages, then we just need them in one. Of course, if you think about this for a little while, you'll see that it's very naive. There are lots of counterexamples where people who speak the same language still end up fighting and killing each other. The American Civil War is an example of that. And anyway, which language is going to be the one that gets chosen as being the single one? Is it, are you going to insist that everybody in India has to speak Hindi, for example? These are difficult questions. So that's not a very good answer. No, we shouldn't care. We should care. Why? Because some people say we need diversity. And the kind of ecological analogy is that a diverse ecology is much better. We are not subject to the vagaries of historical changes and shifts, but it's more sustainable. A stronger argument is that languages express identity, and so we should be pay attention because of the close connection between, in many communities, but not all communities, between language and the identity of that particular group. Now, beware here, a lot of the argumentation here, often expressed around this topic, is essentialist, absolutist, and also objectifying. So there is some connection between language and identity, but it is not an absolute and necessary one for many different groups. A stronger argument, to my mind, is that it's important to care about diversity because languages are repositories of history and culture. Every community that we have looked at around the world has oral history and oral culture, songs, stories, mythology, narratives about the group and its history and where it came from and what's happened and so on. And these are expressed through the languages, through the poetry, through the songs, through the storytelling. Languages are also important. Diversity is important because language is part of human knowledge in general, and each language represents a different view of the world. So from a kind of global perspective, we are all of us strengthened and have a better understanding of what it means to be a human being because all of the different languages are different lenses or perspectives on how humans are in the world. That argument, of course, is not necessarily very relevant to an individual villager who happens to be discriminated against and who feels that their language is not helping them. Languages do have economic value. They are useful in things like trade and interrelationships, and multilingualism with languages serving as means of wider communication is something that we've already mentioned previously. And so learning languages, maintaining languages is important from an economic perspective. And as linguists, people interested in languages and linguistics, of course, we would say that, yeah, diversity is important because languages are inherently interesting. They have interesting structural features, interesting social features, interesting functions that vary from one community to another. And that's something that is academically or from a research perspective of interest to us. So is it a hopeless situation that we can't do anything about? Is it inevitable that languages will always disappear? And the answer is no. There is some evidence that language shift can be reversed. And there are a few examples I'll present, but there are many others around the world. Welsh has more speakers now than as children than it has had for a very long period of time. The Maori language in New Zealand has seen a reversal in falling speaker numbers through introduction of a system they call language nests or kohangareo, where a whole new generation of speakers has been produced. And so 30 years ago, they were seeing the same shift with children not really speaking that much Maori in many areas. Today, as a result of this introduction and mother tongue education, we find students at university doing their studies in Maori and writing their dissertations, etc., in Maori. Hawaiian has a similar model. Taiwan has recently reversed its monolingual language policy. Mexico has also just last week recognized indigenous community languages as important and in needing support. So there are lots of examples around the world where the shift that's going on is being addressed, and we are seeing changes in the diversities of given language situations. So how could we respond? Well, amongst most academics and linguists and the majority of the general community, the answer is nothing. Just don't do anything. Don't just ignore it. Oh, so what? Language is disappearing. Okay, let me get on and study English. Another response is to say, well, that's a terrible shame. It's really bad. I'm sorry to hear that. And maybe I can give some money to organizations like Society for Endangered and Lesser Known Languages, because they're doing good stuff. They're publicizing, they're doing videos online. Here's, 100 rupees, get on with it. Not doing anything themselves. A third possibility is to make lots of noise and organize events, but not actually do anything in terms of having an impact on the contemporary distributions and contemporary language use. And a nice example of this is UNESCO. The United Nations declared last year to be the International Year of Indigenous Languages, and there was lots of celebrations. Australia even issued a stamp to celebrate this year. And there were what I call noisy lamentations. Lamentation means crying, or, the sort of thing that happens when people get upset at funerals or whatever. Lots of international events, workshops, publicity, but at the end of the year, and now 12 months later, did this really impact language shift? And I would suggest probably not, at least not in the short term. Sadly, much of this kind of international publicity uses the rhetoric or words of death or dying, disappearance, loss. There's a lot of talk of ancient languages and cultures. The ancient languages of the Andamans are dying. And I really dislike this particular way of talking. It introduces negativity that is unhelpful to the discussion, as well, of course, to silly ideas like ancient languages. I'm sorry, languages exist now. They're not, and they all have histories, and there's no real value. Although this is a very common sort of trope or way of talking. Because it tends to, and there's a huge tendency in all of this to objectify, treat languages and speakers as things that are separated from their human, social, and cultural context. And I think the worst example of this in my mind, or one of the bad examples, is a film by Lena Herzog called Last Whispers. There's a link there, you can go and have a look, and it's a beautifully designed film, but it presents snippets and little clips of somebody speaking something from sort of bits and pieces of languages thrown together. No notion of who the people are, why they are doing that, what they're talking about, etc. It's a kind of artistic usage, which is a pastiche or a mashup of bits and pieces of things. And this is, to my mind, is quite a poor and unhelpful way to think about language diversity. A more positive approach would be to want to find out some more, come along to a talk like this, do some reading, speak to other people, networks, get involved in things like SEL, which will open up opportunities to learn more. If you're a linguistics student, I strongly encourage you to broaden your reading and studies to include anthropology, politics, ethics, social justice, and notions of decolonialization. Because if we really want to understand language situations and contexts around the world and why diversity is changing, we need to understand the background in terms of socio-political, ethical, and legal changes that are happening. We can work with members of communities, try to understand patterns of language use, and language attitudes. As I mentioned before, attitudes are really fundamental, both from a community side as well as from a wider government and organizational perspective. So ideologies of language use and choice are important to understand as part of confronting language shift. We also need to think about, are there ways to deal with the underlying issues that drive these linguistic changes that we've been talking about? So there are underlying social, political, economic, health, welfare, and social justice factors that lead to language shift. So people don't shift languages just because they want to necessarily. They may at an individual level, but at a social level, at a contextual level, the underlying factors are often things that have to do with lack of economic support and discrimination of various sorts, and health and welfare issues where people feel that they would be much better off to shift to another situation or environment and to change their language use. If we could understand that and also look at, are there ways to address this in terms of providing support for things like health? Can that have a consequence in terms of people not feeling that they need to shift their languages, or feeling that they can add a language of wider communication without losing the languages that are used in a particular local context? And often communities simply don't understand what's going on. They see what's happening in their house or maybe the next door neighbor's house, but not really realizing on a more local and global perspective what is happening in terms of changing demographics and changing language preferences. We can also inform stakeholders in international organizations, governments, and the general public. And organizations like UNESCO have played a role there, although, as I've said earlier, some of their activities I don't find particularly helpful. We can also look at documenting diversity and vitality by doing sociolinguistic studies, looking at who speaks what language, in what context, when, where, and how. And also surveying attitudes and beliefs about languages. So community members might say, or something like, well, it's better for my children to speak Hindi or English before they go to school, because that'll help them to study better. Well, that may be true, and that's what people may believe, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they can only speak Hindi or English. They can grow up in a bilingual, multilingual context in which each of the languages has a domain or a place somewhere, somewhere within the broader context in which it has a function. So there may be all sorts of ideological or belief aspects which we can try to understand and survey. And one approach to this is participant action research, which engages community members and trains and empowers them to not only understand their language dynamics, but also to think about ways to respond to it and think about, issues of reversal that I mentioned before. And there's an excellent talk by Professor Suradecha from Mahidol University in Thailand, in which she talks about how she's been working with young people in minority communities in Thailand in a participant action approach. So I recommend that to you as a way to sort of look at things. Now, one model that is quite useful in this context is the one called Ethnography of Speaking, developed by Del Himes, where he uses speaking as a sort of summary for the different factors he's interested in, like the setting, the participants, the ends, the goals that people have, the act sequences, so S-P-E-A-K, key for is the key, so the tone or manner of a speech act. I is the instruments or channels, so is it writing, is it oral communication, is it use in using on mobile phones, for example. The social rules that govern participants' actions and the norms, and finally the genre, the kind of interaction, monologue, storytelling, conversation, discussion about how you do certain things like recipes for cooking and so on. Those are different genres, and they are all part of trying to understand the dynamics of given language situations. And there's some work by Saville Troika and others following Hymes that have a rich analytical approach to this ethnography of communication. And I think this is really fundamental for us to get a grip on what's happening in given contexts before we then go on to think about studying the linguistic structures and system itself. But we can do that because if the conditions are right and the community is supportive, it is possible to do documentation, production, and support for language ecologies. All right, we're not local languages, but we're talking about ecologies, and to do so in a respectful, ethical, and collaborative manner. And there's an approach that has emerged in the last 20 odd years called language documentation, which aims to develop theory and practice for doing this kind of documenting of language situations, which would result in multifunctional and long-lasting records. It's a specialist area that requires training, and I've been involved in some of this in Karnataka, in Mysuru at the Central Institute of Indian Languages. We had planned to have a training program this year, but due to the pandemic, that had to be suspended. And hopefully next year, if things improve, we will have another one. If the conditions are right and the community is supportive, we may be able to revitalize languages or help to maintain and strengthen them. Activities like, for example, what we saw in New Zealand or Hawaii may be possible if the situation is right. And these can be supported by the sort of documentation that was mentioned earlier. So increasing the domains of language use, especially when we're talking about digital contexts, or increasing the numbers of speakers, adult speakers and also children speakers. Maintenance is supporting languages through education and literacy and use of spoken and written media. So I've been doing some of this work in Australia, working with, this is the Diari Aboriginal community in South Australia, and there are 4 generations of people here working together on trying to understand the context and how Diari is used and spoken. It's important to disseminate and spread information amongst the community themselves and also more broadly, so that all of the kinds of things we've been talking about today can be part of communicating, raising awareness, and using things like social media, exhibitions, and the arts to promote diversity. We can produce books, publications, media, training courses. This can sometimes be challenging for academics, researchers, and professors who are not used to explaining their work in terms that educated, ordinary people can understand. To get away from a very academic approach to one which is more comprehensible to members, ordinary people in the world. So I did a book, for example, called 1,000 Languages, translated into lots of different languages. And that was aimed at the general public. We've been involved at SOAS in various exhibitions, working with artists, working with people who are specialists in art and representation. We used to run a thing called Endangered Languages Week, in which we had public performances, we had people talking about situations, showing movies and so on. As Meti mentioned earlier, I'm very active in blogging, and I've blogged about different language contexts, and as part of raising awareness, raising general understanding, and also offering opportunities to learn some of these languages. Song has been quite a fundamental part of this, and the Deary blog, for example, has a lot of material on singing and songs that we've been doing. Here's some training that we did at CIIL, the two groups from 2018 and 2019, and as I mentioned, hopefully in the future, more of this. So this kind of activity can be done very much locally, working together with local community members, informing stakeholders, providing reliable and comprehensive information, and helping communities to understand their situations, and providing support and training where it's feasible to do that. So there's a huge range of possible activities, and depending on the context, depending on the interest, depending on the history, some or all of these may be possible. So the sort of general conclusion that we might draw is that this is something that is going to be have an impact everywhere around the world. No country is isolated, no country can escape the fact that there are linguistic, cultural, social, political, economic issues that need to be addressed, and that are resulting in discrimination and negative impacts at various kinds of various levels. No country can afford to adopt a monocultural ideology. The political and economic costs of this are too high, and the opportunities that are missed are too great. And this is something we are battling here with in the United Kingdom, this often undifferentiated, unexamined, monocultural way of thinking, and trying to address this and help people understand that it actually is not a very useful approach is something that linguists are playing a role in. We need much better education about values and benefits of multilingualism and multiculturalism. I see in India, I see tendencies among some people to really push back against the diversity, and the importance here of intercultural communication is really significant. And as I say, there's a tendency for people to put themselves into little groups and to say, we are under attack and so on, and that's a very dangerous result. So we need more training at all levels to understand the socio-politics of language and culture. Linguistics in particular has tended to focus on phonology, morphology, syntax, the sort of mechanics of language structure. And what I'm arguing is that's fine, but it also needs to be supported by understanding what's actually going on from an ethical, moral, social justice perspective in terms of the socio-economic and political and cultural side of language diversity and language use. And there are lots of opportunities to participate in trying to contribute to the continuing richness of the world's linguistic and cultural diversity. There are lots of avenues for doing all sorts of things, from artistic representations through to working closely with individual communities. And to me, it is the students and early career scholars, especially Indigenous researchers, who can lead the way in the future to appreciate multilingualism, excellent quality research and the concern for the needs of minority communities to document, preserve, and develop their linguistic and cultural heritages, both locally in local communities, but also from a global perspective. And it's up to you to choose, if you want to participate in this, to learn about it, to do some study, to get some training, and to take whatever direction you feel comfortable with in terms of responding to the situation of language endangerment around the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Peter. It's a very excellent talk and very comprehensive talk. And we are very grateful to you for your time and your talk. So now I request participants and distinguished audience to raise your questions and queries. You can also directly ask your questions, or you can put into the chat box. And in this talk, we have looked at various aspects regarding language endangerment and what it means for a language to be endangered. How do we decide if languages are threatened or not? How many languages are endangered in India and around the world? How can students, researchers, governments, community members, and the general public respond to language endangerment? So these are some of the important aspects he raised in this particular talk. So now it's the time for discussion. So you please make a quick response and short questions. Please don't take much time because we are running a short of time. Thank you.
So I can see in the chat there's a question about economic aspects.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so this is a really important one, and it's something that many groups around the world are confronting and trying to think about. How can they, you know, if economic factors are so important in things like urbanization and people moving away from their villages, what can we do locally to support people's livelihoods? And I think there are some interesting possibilities. I've been involved with a group in Australia called the Bayungu Aboriginal Community, and they have actually started a tourism development in which they last year they were able to, through the courts and through the legal system, to get ownership of their traditional lands. And they now take tourists for travel tours through that traditional area. They explain about the significance of different places, why they are important to the community culturally and historically. And at the end of the day, the tourist group will have a chance to eat some food and to sit down in an informal way to talk to community members. And what the tourists are very interested in is the history, the culture, the language, the songs, the performances of that particular group. And they're really happy to pay money to get a possibility to meet community members and to participate in that. And they do it in a respectful way. They learn a lot as a result of the interaction. It also has had a very positive impact on younger people from the Bayungu community, because they see the language that, you know, maybe their grandmother speaks is actually important here, because the tourists are willing to come and you know, try and learn something about that. So where they may have had a negative attitude, that can be affected by the economic activity that results. Other groups have developed handicrafts. There are communities in Malaysia, for example, where we have very rich cultural and linguistic activities happenings around handicrafts and weaving and so on. So there there are opportunities, and one has to be creative and think about different possibilities. You know, the internet can be important here as well. You know, people can market activities and interactions through the use of websites and so on. Okay.
Two more comments. Hello, Professor Peter.
Yeah. So we have somebody's asking a question: where funding agencies for documenting Indigenous languages? These agencies do exist. Some of them are funded by government. So in India, for example, there are some centers for endangered languages. There's some in, I know in Tamil Nadu there is one. There's a center in Sikkim. There's another center in Jharkhand. These are funded by the central government, and they do various activities. The Central Institute of Indian Languages in Mysuru is also an important funder, and they have a project called SPELL, which is a special project on endangered language documentation and study. So there are opportunities for government-funded agencies, a National Science Foundation in America, for example, and there are also some private foundations. So SEL does support some activities. The Foundation for Endangered Languages, the Endangered Language Fund, these are all agencies where there is some funding support. Okay, somebody's now asked, is there any method to measure how far language shift has happened? Can we map shift? Yes, indeed, we can look at that. And what it involves is study of who speaks what to who, when, where, and how. And the kind of language ecology approach that I mentioned before, the ethnography of speaking. It's important to combine both asking questions of people, so maybe doing a survey or a questionnaire, but combine that with participant observation. That is, spending time with communities, working with local people to observe what's actually happening. Because sometimes people will tell you, oh yes, everybody speaks language X. And when you observe, you discover that actually that's not the case. And people might be speaking to their children in a dominant language like Kannada or Hindi or Tamil, when even if they claim that they are, you know, speaking Toda or Kota or some other language. So we can do surveys and combine that with participant observation. Meti, how much time do we have left?
We have another 10 minutes time.
Okay.
10 minutes more.
Right, so let's have a look if there's any more questions. I don't see anything. Do you have any questions? Is there anyone who has a question or a comment or? Somebody mentions here the central government of India, its cultural affiliates wants to revive Sanskrit on the Hebrew model. Well, I mean, I know there is this kind of interest in Sanskrit exists, and there are, in fact, some villages in Karnataka where Sanskrit is in daily use, and I understand children are learning it. Of course, the Hebrew model really is tied up. It's not Hebrew that is crucial here. It's the context, the broader context, as I've been emphasizing. So Hebrew was connected to nationalistic approaches, the Zionist politics of developing a nation state for Jewish people, the development of the state of Israel, and the connection between religious foundations and Zionist political ideologies, and language was a part of that. Of course, modern Hebrew is not the same as the classical language. It's very structurally and functionally very different as a result of the way that it was revitalized. What I see as being problematic in many ways is the tendency for promotion of languages like Sanskrit to be tied up to fundamentalism and ideologies connected with religion and nationalism. Now, how long would it take? Well, how long would it take to do what? To have one speaker or 10 or 100 or, you know, the whole of India? Israel is really, quite frankly, is a very unique and unusual case, and we've never seen anything like that anywhere else in the world. Language revival that has taken place in contexts like New Zealand or North America involves thousands of people, but it's a much long-term. The Maori cases involve 30 years of activity, almost 40 years of activity. I can't see that Sanskrit is going to suddenly be spoken by millions of people, you know, in a very short time. Can we establish a language documentation center in Nepal? Well, that's a fantastic question. There are quite a few people who are working on documenting languages and sociolinguistics in Nepal, both within Nepal themselves and people who live outside. So Professor Yadava, for example, is one of the leaders in that work at the universities in Kathmandu. So there is activity, although, and I believe there is a language survey that is being done for Nepal, quite low key. So there is activity, and if you contact people at the university in Kathmandu, then you will be able to talk about what might be happening. And there are many specialists in the United States, in Australia, and in other places who are working in Europe to document and study and support Nepalese language contexts. How do we make language documentation work more relevant to the speakers of the language? Well, it really involves fundamental discussion. And if you look at Professor Suradecha's talk, for example, some of the ways that she works with the young people, empowering them, leading them to drive the research, to create the goals, to talk about how the work might be constructed, not coming in as an outsider and saying, this is what we're going to do, this is the project, you do this. But it's a sort of empowering, sustainable kind of approach. And that will be much more impactful and effective immediately, but also in the longer term. Yeah, somebody mentions academic grammars. Indeed, this is an issue. There are people who are working on community-based grammars, so ways of understanding how languages are organized and structured that are not about, you know, phonology, morphology, complex linguistic concepts, but concepts that are more straightforward. And there's some really interesting work being done in some communities in the Pacific in particular, which is writing grammars in the language itself. So actually doing monolingual research where you explain what's going on in the language itself and studying that. And that, I think, is a really interesting and very positive development we're seeing. And I have a talk about that. If you look at some of the talks that I've presented, there's some information about this kind of thing. Oh, the questions are coming quick and fast. I can see 10 more. I'm mindful of the fact that we are now an hour and 15 minutes. So I'm wondering if we should be thinking of finishing up, Meti. What do you think? If you can collect the chat, if you can download the chat, then I'm happy to respond to people separately. And I encourage you to download my talk, and through my website you can actually communicate with me. Fill in a form there, and I'm happy to respond to questions.
Thank you, Professor. Any more questions? Okay. Thank you very much for questions and the discussion.
If you can please save the chat. There are other questions, and I'm happy to reply to those individually.
Please. You can take another 10 minutes and you can respond.
Okay, you want to keep going, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so what have we here? Are Welsh speakers bilingual? Yes, all Welsh speakers today are bilingual, and there are use of the language varies. So there are some people who feel much more comfortable, older people, for example, in the northern part of Wales, who feel much more comfortable speaking Welsh rather than English, but everybody can choose to speak either Welsh or to speak English. And it's a nice example where adopting a bilingual approach and having mother tongue immersion education at school has supported and strengthened that particular language. Somebody's asking about language attitudes, how to study language attitudes. Well, there are surveys that you can do, questionnaires where you ask people when what language do you use when you talk to your grandmother? Is it good or bad that people in your community speak languages? If you met a stranger on the road and they started speaking Tulu to you, what would you think about that? What kind of attitude might you have? So there are studies, ways of studying that, and particularly in sociology and the sociology of language, there's been quite a lot of research on how to explore language attitudes. My colleague Julia Salabank at SOAS is a specialist in this area, and she's published some books about that topic.
There's
See,
one book
of mutual intelligibility for South Asia. No, that's a really, really difficult question. I want to emphasize that this question also runs into the problem we had earlier of absolutism and trying to objectify languages and language contexts. Intelligibility, language intelligibility or mutual intelligibility is variable. It varies a lot from person to person and from context to context. And intelligibility can be, and often is, asymmetrical. So I may be able to understand some other person their way of speaking, but they may not be able to understand mine. So it's quite common around the world for people who speak a minority variety, a minority dialect or language, to be able to understand the more dominant variety, because it's the one that they see in education, on the media or television, radio, in the newspapers. But the speakers of that variety cannot understand the local variety, even within what we might call the same language. So to give you an example, in the United Kingdom, when people from London go to Glasgow, they can't really understand. When they hear local people speaking English, their local Glasgow English, in an informal manner between friends, they really struggle to, the we and they really struggle to understand it. But the people in Glasgow, of course, can understand London English, because that's what they hear on radio, television. You turn on the BBC, you turn on any radio station, you will hear London English. So in that case, the intelligibility is asymmetrical. And I don't know of much work that has been done, particularly in South Asia, on exploring intelligibility between different areas, different groups, different individuals. Of course, intelligibility is also a function of attitudes. So if I really want to understand you, then I will try hard. But if you're somebody who is of a different religion, a different group, a different ethnic identity, then that I don't like, then I probably won't bother to make any effort. And so I will say, oh, I can't understand that. That's gibberish. That's nonsense. That's not possible. So this is a very difficult and complex question that needs further exploration. Okay, let's move on. The role of technology. There's a whole talk I could give about the role of technology. It's often presented that, you know, the computer or the web or the internet or mobile phones will save your language. This is nonsense. The only thing that will really support languages is people speaking them, having places and people that they can use the language with. Now, it may be that technology is helpful as an instrument in doing that. For example, using the language on Facebook or WhatsApp or through some social interactional technology. But that's an instrument. So if you think back to what I said about Heims, S-P-E-A-K-I-N-G, it's, you know, it's all of the other things along with the I or instrument. So technology has a role, but it's a part of a much bigger picture involving all of those other dimensions of language, understanding language use and language functions. When am I coming to Mysuru? Well, we had originally planned to be there in July this year. Myself and my former SOAS colleague, Julia Salabank, we had plans, we'd worked out a schedule. We were going to, with our friends and colleagues at CIIL, we were going to run a workshop, but that had to be cancelled because of the pandemic. We'll see if it's possible next year. If travel becomes feasible, then we'll see what might be able to happen. Somebody asked me to go to Shivamogga. Thank you very much for your invitation. I've traveled around a little bit in India. I have been to other places in Karnataka. I have not yet visited your place, and that's very kind, and I would be interested in doing this. Books and so on available in India. There's actually quite a nice manual that CIIL developed, and I can recommend that as a place to start. Actually, SEL has quite a bit of information on their website. There's the Society for Endangered and Lesser Known Languages. So if you Google SEL India, you might be able to get access to some pointers of stuff there. Okay, does vernacular language have a role in ensuring quality of education? The answer, again, that would be a whole talk to really discuss that. The answer is quite simply yes. All of the work that's been done looking at mother tongue education, of vernacular language education, demonstrates that children who are studying and learning in their own languages, in the languages they speak in the home, do much better in terms of educational outcomes. And in fact, it's been demonstrated that they do much better in the majority language or languages if they do their early education in their mother tongue. So there's some nice work that was done in Thailand, in southern Thailand, that showed that amongst the Patani Malay community in Thailand, once they changed from teaching only in Thai to teaching in Patani Malay in the early years of education and then gradually introducing Thai, they discovered that the Patani students actually did much better in their Thai than the Thai students who spoke Thai at home. So once they had a foundation in their own language and had developed literacy skills, for example, they were actually able to transfer this and bolster their understanding and learning of Thai because of the foundation they already had in their own language. So I think this is a really fundamental issue, that mother tongue education actually has very positive outcomes, not only for the language, but also for content learning of things like mathematics and science, but also learning the majority languages and learning languages of wider communication. Okay, somebody says, come to University of Rajasthan. I've actually been to the Central University in Ranchi. I went there as was invited there about 4 years ago. So I would like to go back again. Many places in India that would be very nice to visit. Okay, so we must be running out of time now. Meti, do you want to wrap up?
Yeah. Thank you so much for your talk as well as the discussion. So now I request our respected principal, Dr. Dhananjaya KB, to give quick and brief presidential remarks. Over to Dr. Dhananjaya KB, principal.
So are we done, or what would do you want to do?
We are here, the part. Okay.
I'm sorry, I don't understand. Do you want to finish now or what?
Yeah.
Principal is giving deciding the box.
Hello.
Our principal is, speaking to us. Am I audible?
You are, but you're the only person I can hear.
You are the only person you can hear.
Oh,
not
you
the
mute,
principal.
mute ಆಗಿದೆ.
Mute ಆಗಿದೆ.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you, one and all.
Okay. Thank you. Dhananjay KB. Now may I request colleague and friend Dr. Avinash T, Department of English, to propose Dr. Avinash.
Good evening, participants. We are coming to the end of our 3-day international web talk series. In fact, I should tell you that it was a marvelous experience for us, we research scholars, on behalf of Wipro University and Department of Linguistics. I would like to extend thanks to Professor Peter Austin. Sir, your talk was very systematic, highly educative and inspiring. As some of the participants have told you, when you come to India, please visit us once again, sir. Thank you. Thank you. I would like to thank administrators of Wipro University, Honorable Registrar, Professor S.S. Patil, and Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor B.P. Virgo. On behalf of Department of Linguistics, Sahyadri College, and Department of PG Studies in English, I would like to extend my thanks to you, sir. I should also thank our patron, friend, guide, and philosopher, Dr. K.B. Dhananjaya, principal, young and energetic principal of our college. Thank you. Well, we are, I should tell you that in a college like Sahyadri Arts College, it's not easy to invite great scholars from across the world. And this was done by my friend, Dr. Meti Mallikarjun, who took a lot of academic interest in this, organizing this seminar, contacting resource persons of great eminence. So thank you, Meti, once again. I should also thank my friend and senior faculty member, coordinator of PG Studies in English, Dr. M.K. Veena. Thank you, madam. I really appreciate and thank all the participants who have participated in this 3-day wonderful webinar. And in fact, the audience was highly knowledgeable, interactive, and those people who have come from London, England, Nepal, Bangla, Pakistan, Indonesia, across India, we
appreciate your
faculty members from Sahyadri academic endeavors. Thank you. And with this, we would like to end up our 3-day web talk. And we also assure you that Department of Linguistics and Department of PG Studies in English are going there. We are going to organize web talk series number 3 on translation studies in the forthcoming days. We will announce the schedule. We will announce the date. Please join us once again. Thank you, one and all.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. Thank you once again.
Okay, goodbye. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you. Namaskaram.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, boss. Thank you.
ಇದು ಝೂಮ್ ತಾನೆ
ಹಾ
ಎಕ್ಸಿಟ್